Hey guys, it's Norm from Tested.
And I'm Jeremy from Tested.
That's right, Jeremy is here with me today because we are going to review the iPhone 6s and the iPhone 6s Plus, Apple's new iPhones for the year. Now the phones have been out for a while. They've been out for about a month. We got them day one, and we've waited to do the review because we wanted to really live with the phones.
Yep.
And we're kind of come at them from different perspectives. You, as someone who's owned every single iPhone.
Every iPhone.
And me, as someone who had all the iPhones until the 5, and then switched to Android, and I loved Android, and then coming back for the 6S.
So the 4S was your last phone?
I had the 5 for a few months.
The 5 was your last phone. Okay.
Yeah, and I gave that to my parents. And the way we're going to structure this conversation is we're actually going to talk about, I think, 12 salient points, the 12 things, features and things we've noticed about using the new 6S phones for this year. Some of that's going to be talking about speeds and feeds. Some of that's going to talk about user experience. And at the end, give you some recommendations as well if you're still on the fence. So first thing, I think the big flagship feature, and there are many of them, but is 3D Touch. Mm-hmm. And that's something you're not going to get. Maybe going forward, you're going to see on a lot of Apple products, but it has appeared before in some capacity on the watch, for example.
That's right.
In Force Touch. And the way it works, it's well integrated with iOS, is that the screen now can sense pressure. And Apple has activated and given the apps the ability to detect different levels of pressure, and you can press it one level of hardness or press it deeper to do things like activate shortcuts.
It's sort of an analog feel. Like it's not just two levels, which was how they pitched it. It's actually more of like a sensation of pushing harder and harder and harder and harder until you reach different thresholds.
Right.
Which I think is great.
Now the glass doesn't actually bend or depress.
Right.
It's all in kind of the software in detecting the micro movements of how much pressure you're putting onto the phone. The way it's implemented, though, I think a lot of people have called it out as like a right click. For example, if you're in Windows or if you're in Mac OS and you right click on a mouse, you see a context menu. You see your properties, you create shortcut, all that stuff.
It's a way to do everything that you could do, even opening an app.
That's right.
Yeah.
With 3D Touch on iOS, it's not a right click. What it is actually a menu of shortcuts within the app. Right. It's a way for you to access, for example, in the camera, going directly to shooting video or directly to shooting a selfie camera. And as shortcuts, I think that's a really great way to use this context-sensitive menu.
Sure. Yeah, the problem, though, is that nobody's supporting it yet besides Apple.
That's right.
We're already a month in, and I don't think any of Google's apps support it yet. Mm-hmm. And as someone who uses Inbox for email, that would probably be my most used 3D Touch app, but it just doesn't support it. And unfortunately, there's no way to tell which apps do support it. You just have to test it. You have to try every single icon, and if it doesn't support it, it sort of blurs out the screen and it goes,
Right, right. It's one of those things that because app updates come pretty frequently and like overnight, every time I see, there are app updates, I go to test it out and try and hold and press hard on that icon, and more often than not, it's just giving me that
Right.
No context sensitive, no right click, no shortcut menu.
It's a new feature that's as much hardware as it is software. Unlike like a camera improvement, which is just immediate and you can appreciate it all at once. This, because it has this software component, it requires people to get on board and implement it.
Right. And there's no way right now, I think, for developers to even let you customize what those shortcut options are. It could, if a developer wants to give you 5 shortcut options, but you only use 2 of them, or you want to change the order of them, you can't do that right now. Yeah. So hopefully going forward, that's something you can use. And even Apple's own apps, I want to see 3D Touch used more frequently.
It's a feature that has a ton of potential for power users especially.
Now, do you use that peek and pop? For example, if you're in Messages and clicking harder a link for an address to pop up a map or show a preview of a website?
Well, it's a cool feature, but I don't get too many text messages that include those kind of links. It's mostly just conversational. I do use it in the photo app. It's a way to sort of enlarge the grid of photos so you can take a look at them quickly. So no, I wouldn't say I use the peek and pop as much as they, spent time demoing it in their demonstrations. So along with the 3D Touch, there's also this feature that they're calling taptic feedback, right? So we got that first in the watch, and now they've implemented the same taptic engine inside the phone.
Right. It's basically just a different vibration motor.
It's a different rumble.
It is one of those things I think that when people can nitpick about, like if they're looking at differences between generations of phones. Oh, is the motor stronger this year? Is it annoying on the side of the bed?
Yeah.
And this one is a completely different motor. clear.
Have they ever upgraded the motor?
They've made it quieter. They've made it stronger.
Okay.
It totally is one of those things.
But it's always been a kind of rotational rumble. It's always been something that speeds up and slows down.
Yeah.
This one, they can start it and stop it in a millisecond. Like they can do just one pulse, or they can do 2 or 3. They have a lot of control over what it feels like.
And I think pulses is a great way to describe it. Now, the big question we had, because it is also something that they introduced first in the watch, is does it feel localized? Does it feel like haptic feedback? If I'm pressing on one part of the screen, does it feel like it's bumping up where I touched in that part of the screen?
That's kind of the holy grail. I think that's what we want.
And I think if you like want to believe and you close your eyes, you can imagine it does.
Yeah.
But it really just is across the entire phone. Right. That it gives you that pulse. And because it is aligned with 3D touch, like if I'm hard pressing an icon, I want to feel like that icon is pressing back at me. Kind of does feel a little bit like that.
I think because they have so much control over when you get the feedback, that lends it to feeling like it's localized.
Yeah. That motor actually also adds a lot to the weight of the phone. And something I noticed was that the 6S Plus weighs a lot. It feels hefty. If you compare it to something like the 6 or the 6S, the regular one, or even last year's Plus, it is noticeably heavier. Yes. You look at phones, and obviously they're a metal aluminum body. On the Android side, some of the phones like the Nexus 5, which I really love, I went back to pick that up over the weekend, and it's like, wow, that was a really light phone.
You know, it's a higher grade aluminum this year too. Like it's more, it's heavier than last year's phone because of this new frame, which is a lot more rigid.
Right. Now, another big feature that people really stress on, and one of the reasons people upgrade their phones, is for the camera, the photo quality. As someone who used the 6 before the 6S, what's been your experience?
Well, the S years, they often upgrade the camera. And this year they went from 8 megapixels to 12 megapixels. I feel like it's clearly the best iPhone camera ever, but it's not as huge a leap as maybe like when we went from 5 to 8 with the 4S. I feel like the 4S was the first time that I ever said, I don't need to point and shoot anymore. At this point, like the 8 megapixel is pretty great, and now it's a little bit better. I'm not using those extra pixels for much because I don't necessarily need them. And it's not getting as much detail because the sensor is the same sensor as it was last year, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. Well, it's the same size sensor. And when we think about camera phones, point and shoots, or even DSLRs, you look at the physical dimensions of that sensor. Now, because the phone is only so big and the sensor is aligned with the lens it can use, they actually have the same physical size sensor with the same lens, but the sensor they're using now has more pixels in there. There are more slots for photons to drop in.
They found a way to isolate each of those slots too.
Now, in practice, what that means is that when you look at a 12 megapixel photo from the 6S, you can crop in more. You can do better digital zooms. You'll get finer details in like hair, for example. But if you're just looking at a photo on your phone, or even in a web browser, or you do any additional level of compression, I don't think it's that big of a difference from the 6. In my comparison between what I think is still the best camera phone sensor, the LG G4, which also shoots in RAW and has a wider aperture lens, I think that still beats out the iPhone, at least in detail. Now, where the iPhone camera sensor really excels is tonal quality, skin tones, and taking portraits of people. And in photos of just faces, it looks really nice.
Yeah, I will say when I do take a picture now and I zoom in, it remains sharper than it used to. So yeah, there's definitely certainly an appreciation for more pixels there.
Yes, and of course there is optical stabilization on the 6S Plus models.
As there was last year.
As there was last year. There's stabilization both in photos and also for video, 30 FPS video. Now that moves us to talking about video. Another flagship feature, because there's a faster chip in here on the A9, it can now process 4K video. And you made a really good point. When you think about a 12 megapixel sensor, the resolution of that is 4,000 by 3,000. And that 4,000 pixels wide is what you would need.
It's just about what you need for 4K video.
Just about what you would need to do 4K video. If you had an 8 megapixel sensor.
It's like 3820.
Yeah, right. You could 3860. You couldn't actually process that. So 3040. With the 4K video, my big question was, why would you need 4K video? This is only a 1080p phone on the highest end, and not even near that on the 6S.
And the Apple TV, even the new Apple TV doesn't support 4K video yet. So you need a 4K Mac.
Well, the 4K video does have, it is a higher bit rate. It's 50 megapixel bit rate, and it does shoot at a maximum of 30 FPS at 4K. The 1080p video, you can shoot at 60 FPS, but that's still only about 26 megabits per second. Higher bit rate, you get more detail. So even if you resize that, or if you upload to something like YouTube, YouTube supports 4K video.
Unlimited, yeah.
Yeah, it will look better in full screen. What I really wish, though, was that there was an intermediate, because you either shoot between 1080 or 720, 1080, or 4K. There's no 2.7K. You can't shoot 2560 by 1440. And I wish, I mean, the processing power can obviously handle it.
Yeah.
I wish Apple gave you that option to shoot that at like 60 FPS or 48 FPS or something.
Why would you want that? Just for the higher frame rate?
The higher frame rate, I think. I think, 4K 60 would be the dream, or 4K 48.
Yeah.
But 4K 30, the frame rate matters a lot if you're shooting action, I think. What it is also cool, though, and that's something brought into iOS 9, is you can actually pinch to zoom in your videos. So that's maybe
While
4K.
you're shooting?
No, while you're reviewing it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. When you're watching a video, because this is only a 1080p screen, you can actually pinch and zoom in and see more detail if you're shooting a static shot or something.
I did that on my wife's phone, which is the last year's phone. So maybe that's an iOS 9.
It is an iOS 9 feature.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. There is, of course, high-speed slow motion, but it hasn't changed.
No,
from last year.
that's 720p, and that's 240 frames a second.
Yep. And that's the same as your high-end GoPros.
Yeah, yeah, and you can change that setting in the settings, whatever frame rate you want to record at. But the 240 is pretty awesome.
Right.
I mean, if you have kids, all they want is for you to record in slow motion, and it's a pretty cool feature to have. I think that something that's really, really interesting for the younger folks is that it has an improved front-facing camera.
Much improved now.
Yeah, so they went from what, like a
1.2.
1.2? So they went from 1.2 to
megapixel.
5 megapixels on the front-facing camera.
Yeah.
I'm not a selfie guy personally, but I know that I'm very alone in that.
It's like this point of pride, I think, for internet olds. We're not selfie guys, but if you do Skype, FaceTime, it's going to look better.
It's true.
It's a better sensor in the front, 5 megapixels, and also the phone flashes the entire screen.
Yeah.
It's a novel idea. I think other phones have done it before, but now the iPhone does
It's
it
now
as
the same resolution as the iPhone 4 regular camera was.
Yeah.
It's a great camera.
Yeah, it's some good context. Also, with the cameras, one thing we want to call it is the idea of live photos. Apple did make a big deal about that in their announcement of the phone.
Yeah.
The idea of a live photo, it's just a JPEG stacked on top of a 12 to 15 FPS MOV file, kind of packaged in. So really integrated into iOS and the Mac ecosystem.
Like 2.5 seconds before and after your shot is taken, right?
So the camera processor is continuously rolling.
Right.
And when you take the photo, it will not only snap the photo, but also capture time before and after. And I think I've actually grown accustomed to it. I like it.
Really?
I do turn it on and off, so I know if I'm taking just a picture of food that's not moving.
Yeah.
I'm not going to turn it on.
There's no penalty for leaving it on, really, except it does take up a little more space.
About twice as much space as a regular high-resolution photo. So it can add up over time. And then you activate it in your photo roll by just hard pressing the screen. And it is something that will be brought into the photos for Mac OS.
Yeah. You do have to hard press it in order to view the whole footage, but what's interesting is if you're scrolling through your photos, when you come to a live photo, as it scrolls on the screen, you get this almost Harry Potter-like animation that freezes onto your photo.
So let you know, cue you up, that is a live photo.
Yeah.
What I don't like is that there aren't a lot of places to view them outside the Mac ecosystem.
Yeah.
I think Facebook was experimenting with live photo style profile pictures. So maybe with so many people with iPhones, that gives them a reason to incorporate that feature. And I also found that when I'm thinking about taking a live photo, like a kid, for example, one of our friends' children, like doing funny things, I focus less on taking the photo. And the photo itself ends up being kind of bad.
So you're kind of taking a short video clip.
Yeah, it's almost like that. Right, and you can think of it two ways. If you want to just take the photo and suddenly have, as a bonus, a little live photo, live video. Or if I'm thinking like, okay, I want to capture this 4-second moment, and the photo is kind of just the thumbnail for that.
It is an interesting concept. I mean, you have to, normally when you take a photo, once you're done clicking, you think you're done, but if you're thinking about taking a live photo, you have to hold it even after you've taken the photo, to continue to capture that moment in time.
And Apple will be bringing in a software update so that it'll turn off the live photo if you just take your phone away. If you lower your phone.
Oh, have they said that?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
But it hasn't been implemented just yet. Another thing, in addition to live photos, Siri is a little better.
Well, Siri listens to you all the time now, which is a feature that you guys had on Android for years now.
Yeah, there are some dedicated co-processors on some phones, like Motorola's phones had the co-processor, so you can say, "Okay, Google,"
Right.
and it'll pop up the search. And Siri, in the last generation, with the iOS update, you can plug it in. So if
As long as it was plugged in, she would do the same thing. But now she listens all the time.
so
if
you have to train your voice.
Yeah, well, what do you mean? So if you have to say, hey, that's right. So now she makes you say, hey, Siri, a few times and say your name and things like that. But if you say, hey, Siri, anytime, although she's not waking up now, hey, Siri. No, nothing.
Nope, neither of us. And that's the thing with this feature. It's more hit than miss, in my experience.
You mean the other way around?
More miss than hit, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe that's just because I've become so accustomed to using Amazon's product, the Echo, which is flawless when it comes to listening to you in a room. The mic on the iPhone was not designed for that, so I don't. I mean, I understand that it's not as perfect, but it's certainly not a feature that I'm using at all because if I ever was using it before, it was when I was in the car and when it was plugged in, so it worked anyway.
Yeah.
And it's just not a feature that has any utility for me right now.
It's almost one of those features where when it works, I feel like, oh, awesome, it worked this time.
Right.
And coming from Android, I really do miss the direct access to Google. Now you told me you can actually have Siri just Google anything by saying Google in front of the phrase, in front of the question.
Yeah, for a Google query, but you certainly don't have your Google Now stuff access to the other Google services.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned the processor a little earlier, and the processor, the new A9, is what allows for like the 4K encoding. I found that this phone is really fast.
It's nuts fast, yeah. And the fact that it can shoot 4K video, from a technical standpoint, is just blow away. I mean, the shoot and edit in iMovie,
yes.
I mean, it's amazing that you can do this now, basically desktop level processing on a phone.
That's right. You can actually, I hadn't touched iMovie in such a long time, and shooting 4K video and not being able to layer on top and clip and edit, it does drain a lot of power. Yeah. But you can do it. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think people should experiment with that.
The S with the first S phone was a 3GS, and people said that stood for speed. I think it's always kind of stood for speed because the S phones are always a massive speed bump over the previous generation.
Yeah. Now, another thing that's really fast and maybe too fast.
Touch ID. I think
fast.
I mean, I understand that they wanted to improve the speed because who wants to make people wait? But there's one point that I actually do want to wait, and that's when I touch this to check my lock screen to see what my notifications are. Maybe I haven't gotten them all on my watch or whatever reason I have. So what's your solution is if you want to get to your lock screen and actually watch it, you use the power button on the side.
Yes, the sleep button.
Otherwise, if you don't, I mean, if you just tap your lock button, the Touch ID is so fast that you're in instantaneously. I've taken to pressing it with my fingernail. Works just as well.
I mean, Touch ID is just so well integrated. It's really one of the great features of iOS and a testament to how Apple incorporates the hardware and the software. Yeah. I don't think they'll ever give us an option to add like a 1 second delay to slow it down because they want you to access it.
And when you're using it to input passwords, I mean, when you're actually in the App Store or if you're using it to get through a password to get into your bank app or using it to make a payment, you want it to be fast. Yes. So that's the main utility for it. Makes sense. Not having to type in my 30-character password for one password to access everything using Touch ID that's changed my life. I will say that there's something called family sharing. I don't know. You probably don't use that with your house, do you? It's a way that everybody can have their own Apple account. What do they call it? Apple ID. But everybody goes back to one credit card, and you get approval from the people who own the credit card. So the kids can say, "I want this app, Dad," and they just hit it. They say request. I get a notification. Tap if I want to buy. Touch ID. It used to be Touch ID to allow the purchase. No longer, for whatever reason, they disabled that, and so you have to type in your password. I wish that they would bring that back for family sharing because that was my most used Touch ID was for family sharing. And you only can still hold 5 fingerprints on your phone. That's right. That's an interesting limitation. Yeah, who knows why? Maybe it's the amount of RAM that they have in this chip because they're very protective of that fingerprint information. They've said publicly there's no way to access it. It's all very internal. We queue this special chip, and the chip says, "Is that the right fingerprint? Yes or not? But yes or no." But there's no way to get those fingerprints out of there. And so maybe that chip doesn't have enough RAM. Maybe they don't want you to have too many false positives. That's right. If they let you put in 20 fingerprints, it increases the chance of false positives. Who knows? But yeah, 5 fingerprints is what you get. 2 thumbs, 2 index fingers, and a pinky finger when I'm eating chicken wings. See, I get along with just my 2 thumbs, but I do have my fingers otherwise. I don't know, 5 is enough for me. What's been your experience with battery life on this phone? I haven't had a problem with iPhone batteries in years. I mean, this is improved again, which is impressive as always, given that the power has increased and it's using more power. But I charge it every night and I use it all day long. I'm never at 0%.
What people have discovered is, there's a smaller capacity battery in the 6S as opposed to the 6, but you haven't noticed any difference.
Yeah.
In the 6S Plus, the Plus model had a great battery life. Will really liked the battery life on his phone last year, and he's been disappointed. I think it's like good for a full day easily.
Yep.
Sometimes I can get a little over a day and a half, but it really depends on what you're using. Now, I actually have the Samsung chip in here. There are two models of chips. There's the TSMC version and the Samsung version. And in some benchmarks, you can tell the Samsung chips actually drain battery faster with CPU-intensive tasks. If you're doing things like looking for GPS all the time.
If you're running benchmarks, right? I mean, that's basically what it is. I mean, didn't Apple come out and say that's not really fair of them to do that test because it's not real world use?
Right. And I think you can make the argument that in real world use, in my experience, I haven't had short battery by any extent.
Yeah.
But the fact that even with a benchmark, it shows that there is maybe a significant, statistically significant difference. It says something about how the chips are actually different, that you're not going to have the same experience. And maybe the real world use today could be equal, but who knows about apps in the future? If there becomes a killer app that is CPU intensive, then you're going to get a different experience between the two phones.
Yeah, fair point.
So it is something to look out for. If you buy an iPhone 6, download the app, check out which processor you have, and if you have the Samsung one, that one maybe over time won't have as long battery life.
Apple's not going to do any replacements though based on your processor, are they?
No, but you can always, I guess, pay it for the restocking fee.
Yeah.
Something interesting that I think iFixit discovered, and we haven't actually been able to test this, is it's more water resistant.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's almost like, obviously, if you're going to make a product more water resistant, and I think they found like actual lining in there.
Like a gasket.
Like it's not just like a few screws were changed. They actually spent some money in R&D in order to make this more water resistant. It seems like it was a feature that they either just decided not to promote or is beneficial to Apple because it means fewer repairs.
Yes, and for people, I know for the Plus, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have it tied to your wristband. Like people who run with their phones, that was a big problem in the old iPhone days. That's just a nice thing. It's not definitely something not to go swimming with or even take a shower with, but you have to worry less if, for example, you accidentally spill water on it.
Yeah.
It's not going to get in all the nooks and crannies and fry your phone.
Yeah, it's not a reason to get the phone, but it's a nice thing to have if you have the phone.
Yeah.
As far as capacity goes, is this the first year you can do 128 gigs in the phone?
I think you can do it before as well.
You can do it last year? Okay. But they still offer that 16 gigabyte version.
I know. The iPhone, the 6S, is offered in 3 capacity sizes, 16 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes, and 128 gigabytes.
Yeah.
It makes really no sense to me that 16 gigabytes is the lower end.
It's very strange. It's not a doubling anymore. It's a quadrupling for 16 to 64. It's very strange.
And the same price difference. And if you're talking about a device where 4K video is one of their marquee features, it takes up a lot of space.
Yeah.
I'm already on the 64 gig model I'm using. I'm already down to less than like 10 gigs left just because of that.
The fact is, if there's any question at all about what size you should get, don't even consider the 16 gigabyte version, right? I think there is a use case for the 16 gigabyte version, but ironically, it requires more technical savvy than most people probably even care to think about.
That's right. I think a lot of people have come up and asked, should I buy the iPhone 6S? Well, if you have only the $200 plus contract or $300, you want to spend X fixed amount of money.
Yeah.
I would tell them actually to buy last year's version and get the 64 gig as opposed to buying this year's version and get the 16 gig at the same price.
Sure.
You're going to make better use of that storage. So let's jump to our conclusions. And what do you think? What do you think about this year's iPhone?
I mean, just based on what you just said, that's sort of along the lines of what I would say as well, because I think last year's phone is practically as good from a utility standpoint. Like every S phone I have enjoyed buying. The 3GS had awesome speed. You could record video for the first time. The 4S had Siri and it had an amazing new camera. The 5S had Touch ID, like features that actually had a real difference in how I use the phone and what I used it for. This year, Touch ID is interesting, but not Touch ID, I'm sorry, 3D Touch is kind of interesting, but as we said, it hasn't been really embraced yet, or the apps haven't come out yet, so it's hard to tell. And there's really no other feature that has transformed the way I use the phone. It's faster, it's got a higher resolution, it's got some great new features, but it's really the first iPhone I've ever had that, I would have been okay with last year's phone, honestly.
Yeah, Siri was obviously a really big feature, and I think if Apple had come out and partnered with a lot of app developers and made a whole giant ecosystem of 3D touch enabled apps and done some really cool things, then maybe that changes the daily use. But if you're just talking about getting to your selfies quicker or checking your direct messages on Twitter half a second quicker, it's not a reason to buy a new phone this year if you already have the 6.
I feel like this phone marks the point of diminishing returns in terms of iPhone features. I'm curious what they can do in the future that really says to me, I'm going to need that feature. That's amazing. I want to be able to do that. I don't know what that is. I mean, maybe it's like Oculus support or something like that. Fingers crossed. But it would be something. It has to be something that's pretty major because all the improvements now are. I don't want to say incremental, but they don't have the impact that they used to.
And you also still have the software updates every year with a new version of iOS 9.
And I think iOS 9, especially in the iPads, is where those transformative changes happened this year. Yeah. Now that we can do real split screen multitasking, that is a big deal. We can actually do 2 apps at the same time. That changes the way that you use the iPad.
Very cool. Well, those are our impressions after a month of using the new iPhones, the 6S and the 6S Plus. If you have a new iPhone or if you're curious about whether you should upgrade, we'd love to hear from you. Please post a comment in the comment section below. Like our video, subscribe to our channel. But until we see you next time, that's Jeremy. I'm Norm. Bye.
Bye.